Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another wonderful tasting with the Virtual Tasting Society. I am Vadim Perlovsky, and today we are excited to dive into whiskeys from our neighbors to the north, the great north. Winter is here. We're excited to learn about Canadian whiskey, rye, obviously not bourbon, but corn whiskey, and all of the above. We have a really interesting lineup in front of us today. We have 6 different whiskeys to try, as pretty much always. Joining us today is Korai. Thank you for making this possible. And Dave Mitton, who is going to be our expert. On this side of the screen, we have the fantastic members of the Los Angeles Whiskey and Spirits Guild and a few new faces. Welcome. David is the president of the LA Whiskey and Spirits Guild. David, do you want to say a couple words?
Be very happy to, Vadim. As always, thank you very much for all the hard work that you put into bringing us these virtual tasting events. It is very much appreciated. It is great seeing a lot of familiar faces, and for those of you who are new, welcome. It is going to be something that you'll hear kind of repeated throughout the virtual tasting. Is like it's okay to ask the nerdy question. For the presenters that are here, don't worry about going down rabbit holes. We love the deeper dives as well from on your side. So please, as much information as you want to dump on us, it will be great. And I'm really looking forward to this.
Awesome. Thank you, David. As we mentioned, there's a couple of new faces. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know that the regulars know the way we run these things, but we're here to get nerdy. We're here to ask questions. That's why we're here. Use the chat feature all you want. If Dave is comfortable with us unmuting ourselves and sharing tasting notes and doing that, we'll do that as well. But ask questions in the chat and ask questions throughout. That's what we're here for. This is not a one-way TV show. This is a conversation. This is us in a room together, drinking good whiskey, getting nerdy. Think of it as if we were all together in real life. We will have polls. Please participate in those. And yeah, Dave, we have a couple of questions for you. What order should we drink these in?
Well, I was thinking what we do tonight, where this is, correct me if I'm wrong, this is your first Canadian whiskey tasting.
It is.
Okay.
It is.
So I figured we'd go over a little bit of history first, and then get into production and the tasting of the whiskeys. But I figure what we'll do is we'll do JP Weiser's Deluxe first.
Okay.
And then we'll do the JP Weiser's 15-year. From there, we'll do the Pike Creek, Gooderham and Warts, and Lot 40.
Lot 40, and then finish with the flavored.
Yeah, I heard today that there was a vintage JP Weiser spiced found.
Yeah,
that's my storage to blame, honestly, for that. Let me jump in here very quick, guys. This is my 3rd time with you, and I'm really happy to get a ranking. And today we are having a new portfolio. So in 375, we used to have JP Weisers for some years now. And starting from January 1st, we got the rest of the Corby portfolio, which are the Pike Creek, Gooderham Awards, and Lot 40. So we are really happy to get them because some of them are really my favorite Canadian whiskeys. And I was really lucky. A few months ago, I had an extensive education from this gentleman, Dave Mitton, and Gina Fawcett. So Dave, being the global brand ambassador for Canadian whiskeys, he will give you the best information and nerdy education today. I don't mind talking about whiskey, but there's a better name, and I can actually relax and drink myself here. And one stupid question for David. I didn't know you started a fashion brand, brother. Did you see this before?
Oh yeah, the shirts and everything else. I have a whole line. Yeah. It's my side hustle.
I found this on my shelf today. Like I was like, my God, I have to show this. Well, thank you very much, Dave. It's all on you, man.
Amazing. Thanks so much. Thanks for the introduction. It's a lot big shoes to fill, but thanks for joining, everyone. As Korai said, I'm Dave Mitton, the global brand ambassador for all of our Canadian whiskeys at Corby Spirit and Wine. Quick background on myself. I spent close to 20 years working behind a bar, probably about 5 nights a week during those 20 years. I owned and operated several bars in downtown Toronto for about 15 years. And long story short, the company, I kind of did things backwards. Did the bar thing, did the ownership thing. The company approached me because I was using apparently enough of their whiskeys that it stood out compared to other bars in the city. And they asked if I wanted to come on as a part-time ambassador and start spreading the good word of Canadian whiskey. And long story short, it became such a challenge that after the first 2 years, I made the decision to sell the last 2 restaurants, and I came on full time. And I've been doing this for, it'll be 8 years now this June that I've been the brand ambassador for our Canadian whiskeys. When I started, we were sold across Canada and we were entering the US. And in the last 5 years, we've gone into about 20 other countries around the world. So the title global became official about 5 years ago. And when I'm not in lockdown, I do spend my time about 40 weeks a year on the road, traveling and spreading the good love of Canadian whiskey wherever I can. To start off, I think the first thing I noticed when I began this role, one of the first places I was sent to was Portland Cocktail Week. So West Coast, that would have been 2014 US, and I had about 80 bartenders brought in by Pernod Ricard at that time to learn from all the global ambassadors, gin, Scotch, Irish, Canadian whiskey. And when I went up, there was a gentleman, probably 80 people in the room, and everybody had been having drinks for a few hours. And one gentleman stood up and he said, "I just need to tell you before you start, I think Canadian whiskey is made in a very irresponsible way." And he started going to spiel, and it threw me off a little bit. I was brand new at the role. I was, I'm not a scientist, and he just threw me off. Luckily, 2 women in the crowd told him to shut the book up and sit down. And, as he sat down, I was like, no, everyone's got their right to speak. I said, what is it you don't like about how Canadian whiskey is made? And he didn't really know. And I said, okay, well, I've got some bars and I sell lots of different whiskeys around the world. I said, there's over 36 categories of American whiskey, bourbon probably being the most popular. I said, what is it you love about American whiskeys? And he didn't really know. And then Irish, Scottish came up. Long story short, we did become friends afterwards, but I started to realize that no one, including Canadians, wherever I traveled, knew anything about Canadian whiskey. I compare it to us. Everyone knows it's there. It's a soft, sweet whiskey. Everyone knows Canadians are here, but just, don't know everything about us. It's a misunderstood spirit, I should say. For instance, is there anyone here that would consider themselves an expert on Canadian whiskey? I know you're all whiskey geeks and probably know a lot more than I do, but Canadian whiskey is just misunderstood. And it's interesting because it's sold in 170 countries around the world. We sell 24.1 million cases in the United States alone every year of Canadian whiskey. 24.1 million cases in the USA every year of Canadian whiskey sales. The only category that beats us is American whiskey, all the categories together. The state of Texas drinks more Canadian whiskey every year than all of Canada. And there's probably the same amount of people that live in the state of Texas as all of Canada as well, to be fair, but it's really interesting. And as Karai mentioned, Gina Fawcett is our education manager in the US. She's a native, lives in Chicago. Her and I work on all education things together, partners in crime. And the most we can figure from it is it's just always been considered, kind of a light, bland whiskey, not as exotic like Irish or Japanese whiskey, not premiumized as Scotch, not exciting like bourbon. It's just been Canadian whiskey. You buy some Canadian whiskey and people would mix ginger ale with it, something your uncle or grandfather would buy back in the day, and that's how it's been perceived. Now, I'm happy to say, you know, not just our company, there's probably 300 distilleries across the country, 8 big ones, and in the last couple decades, master distillers and master blenders have been really pushing the boundaries and taking advantage of our rules. And, you know, we've got the ability to be quite innovative. So when this young gentleman said that he thought we were irresponsible, it was like, once I'm done talking, I hope you think differently and realize that we have the ability to be incredibly innovative. Couple little dates just before we get into production and drinking is, you know, Canada is a young country. It's just a little over 150 years old. Some of our cities like Montreal are about 400 years old, but Canada is young. So when I'm over in the UK or Europe doing these tastings, I'll talk about how some of the trees or fences outside are older than my country. So a lot had already been done in the world of making whiskey. The Irish created it. Scottish like to say they perfected it. You know, a lot had already been done by the time Canadian whiskey came around. But we do have a pretty cool history. It started off in 1762, right up until 1850, where the Highland clearances in Scotland, where a lot of rich urban landowners were pushing people out of their homes. And with that, the same way a lot of the Irish went to the US, we had a lot of Scottish coming over to Canada. I grew up in East Coast Canada in like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, a lot of Scottish heritage there. So a lot of those people coming over essentially came over with their distilling methods, where they would bring wheat. Wheat was something that the UK brought to Canada. Next date would be 1776. I'm going to guess that everybody on this call knows what was happening that year. Anyone? And I like participating, as you guys said before. 1776.
There was a document that was signed or something or other.
Yep, Declaration of Independence, American Revolutionary War. You know, this story doesn't go over so well when I'm in London talking to bartenders or whiskey clubs, but America won the war. The British did not. So where do you think the British loyalists headed afterwards when they lost the war?
Mexico, right?
I'm sure some did, but a good chunk of people went north. They went to the hills of Kentucky and New Hampshire and New York, and they found their way heading up to Canada. We weren't even a country yet, but they made their way up to Canada. Now, they brought their distilling techniques with them. They brought wheat with them. They brought, a lot of them went by carriage and horse. Some of them brought stills. Now, you've got the Scottish, you've got the English all coming to this part of Canada, bringing in wheat, lots of wheat. Essentially, they taught us to make moonshine. Now, I'm going to guess everyone on this call is very familiar with moonshine. You know, a little bit of a harsher spirit, but at the time, that's what people were making. That's what did the trick. It worked. Where, you know, people across Canada, mostly in Ontario and Alberta, were learning to distill spirit, distill grains, make spirits. It's great. You know, and that in the mid 1800s was a big time for Canadian whiskey. And again, that was a lot to do with the British coming up. Now, another date I always like to talk about, and this I like participation, is what moment in history do you think brought Canadian whiskey to the US?
You mean at first or in large amounts?
That's a great question. Yeah, what brought it first?
First, I would guess the Whiskey Rebellion, but in large amounts, I would say that it would have to be Prohibition.
Right. I like that. That was one of the more interesting answers I've had in 8 years of doing this. Because most people, including myself, always say Prohibition. Everyone knows that. Prohibition brought Canadian whiskey into the United States of America. Now, we'll touch on that a little more in a minute, but when I was new at the job, I was asked, and I said, everyone knows, Prohibition. Prohibition brought Canadian whiskey in. Then I got told, kid, you watch too many movies and TV shows. I was like, no, everyone knows Al Capone, like, you know, distilleries running the water, bringing it over. And sure, that stuff did happen, which we'll talk about later, but on such a small scale. It was presented to me in this way. They said, they're like, you own restaurants? I'm like, yes, I do. I said, what would happen if your customers stopped coming to your restaurants? Like, well, pretty simple math, and more of a touchy subject these days, obviously, but it was like, you know, there'd be no money coming in and we wouldn't be able to pay the bills. Couldn't pay vendors, couldn't pay our staff. We'd go out of business if we didn't have customers. And I said, exactly. Like, what do you think happened to the Canadian whiskey industry when our largest customer in the world, the United States of America, could no longer buy whiskey from us legally? It almost crippled the industry. There would have been 100 distilleries at that time, right before American Prohibition. And by the time American Prohibition was over, I believe there were under 10. And it was kind of the big ones, like, for instance, our distillery, Hiram Walker, did make it through. And we'll talk reasons why later. But American Prohibition almost killed the Canadian whiskey category. What brought Canadian whiskey in to the United States of America? And like a light went off when I heard this. It was the year 1861 to 65, American Civil War. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because back then, where was most of the whiskey made in the US? Down south. So people were melting down equipment to make weapons. People were not making whiskey anymore because they had to go fight. They certainly weren't, the South certainly was not selling any whiskey to the North at that time. So the northern states looked up a little bit more north and bought whiskey from Canada as medication out on the field. And that was how Canadian whiskey did make its way into the United States of America. And it did very well up until American Prohibition. And when Prohibition was over, it came back very strong. I mean, it was up until, this was something I found interesting, starting the job, looking at statistics. It was the #1 selling whiskey category in the United States of America up until 2012, and bourbon took over, which is pretty crazy to think. So there's a lot of Canadian whiskey consumed in the US, but still pretty unknown. Now, I always like to talk about kind of the last date here. I always say it's like the little trivia, tiny little bragging right, because like you say, most things in whiskey had already been done by the time we started producing whiskey. But one thing that had not happened was no country in the world had made a law to have an age requirement on their whiskeys. Canada was the first country in the world to mandate a law to age whiskey. 1887, so 1887, it was mandated 1 year. 1890, it was mandated 2 years. And I'd like to tell you a romantic tale of how it was whiskey makers wanting to make a better product. And they were science nerds about wood, but that's not the case. It was most likely something to do with the government collecting taxes. I mean, if you think back to the mid 1800s, if we were doing a tasting live together and I brought a barrel along and we were drinking whiskey from the barrel, and that barrel happened to be empty, I'm not going to get rid of the barrel. I'm going to bring it back home to work, wherever I keep it, because A, it's worth money. You're going to use it for storage. Something of the time like pelts or fish or pickles, you're probably going to keep in it. But if I've brought that barrel home and kept fish in it for my family, and after a week or so we've eaten the fish, and you take that barrel back to the grocery and grog or the distillery to have it filled up again, that's going to taste pretty horrible. obviously, if you fill up a barrel that had fish in it with whiskey. So the idea to burn those flavors out of the cask comes into play. And at this point in time, we're going to talk about it during the distillation, but Canada had been producing this light styled whiskey when everybody was just used to drinking moonshine. So imagine when you put this light styled whiskey into these barrels that have been lightly charred, and now it has to, by law, no one knew it was going to happen, but by law, it has to sit there for 1 year. And then it gets changed in 1890 that it has to sit there for a minimum of 2 years. We have newspaper articles, one from Hiram Walker, the gentleman who started our distillery, saying that he would have never got into the whiskey business if he would have known that he would have had to sit there on his inventory for 2 years before he could sell it. I mean, think about it now, like all the micro distilleries around the world opening up, what's the first thing everybody makes? Everybody makes a vodka or a gin. Or sure, I should say, what do they sell first? They make vodka, they make gin, they sell it. Opening a distillery costs a lot of money, and it costs a lot of money to run, so they need to make profit right away. Again, this law in Canada shut down a lot of distilleries as well. Most people didn't have enough inventory they could sit on for 2 years before they could sell it again. Now, in the year 1974, federal government changed the law again to mandate Canadian whiskey must be aged a minimum of 3 years. To be honest, I've talked to historians, I've talked to everyone I can. No one can really give an answer of why they chose to do that, but they did. 3 years, I mean, there's a lot of money the government makes off of our whiskey. We currently have 1.6 million barrels laying down, and each one is worth $1,000 in excise tax to the government. So they make pretty nice profit off of us and all the other whiskey producers in Canada. So that's those dates. We talk about Highland clearances, talk about American Revolution, independence. We talk about American Civil War, Prohibition, and then end of Prohibition we didn't really talk about. That was a great time for Canadian whiskey, because during American Prohibition, when it was obviously illegal to come get whiskey from our country or for us to bring whiskey down, but it did happen. I mean, personally, I think it would have been smarter for you to have a little still in the backwoods or have a cousin make it for you. But people were coming across the border. People from Canada were bringing it down. We're going to talk about a couple of our Canadian whiskey barons, but one gentleman in particular named Harry Hatch. Anyone ever hear of Harry Hatch? Neither have I. I've never heard of Harry Hatch. I never did before this job. We didn't learn about this stuff in school growing up in Canada. When you think of Canada, I certainly don't think of gangsters. I don't, maybe the most polite gangsters in the world apologizing after they rough you up. But Harry Hatch was a true gangster. He owned a bar in Oshawa, Ontario, which is not far from Toronto, on the water, by the Great Lakes. He owned a bar, and he also was a salesman for Henry Corby, which is the founder of our company, who used to make whiskey, and he used to sell whiskey for him. And he used to sell a lot of whiskey. And I mean, he'd sell a lot at his bar as well. He sold so much whiskey that he went to the boss and said, I feel like I deserve a piece of the company. I'm selling so much whiskey. So what would happen if you went to your boss and said, I'm doing so well, I think I should own part of the company? I don't know if it would work for anyone on the call. I think I'd probably get laughed out of the room if I went to Corby and Pernod Ricard and said I'd like to own a little bit of it because I'm selling a lot of Canadian whiskey. So he got told to take a hike or, keep his mouth shut or keep selling whiskey. he decided to take a hike, and he went off making as much money as he could. For instance, during American Prohibition, he had fishermen coming constantly from the US over to Canada. He had many patrons at his bar that were fishermen, boaters, and he was a bit of a tough guy. He had enough people that he was strong arming, taking whiskey from Canada that he'd buy, across the water, rum running, back to the US. He was making a small fortune. I mean, he made so much money in that 10-year period that he ended up buying the 4 largest distilleries in Southern Ontario. He bought Henry Corby's distillery, he bought J.P. Weiser's, he bought Hiram Walker, and he bought Gooderham and Worts, which we're all going to talk about later. He bought those 4 distilleries with the money he made. Hence is how it all became a company. And in history, the fishermen from the US and Canada that he was strong arming to bring whiskey to the US during Prohibition were nicknamed Hatch's Army. So Harry Hatch had his little army, Hatch's Army. And I've thought, and I say this all the time, if anyone has any connections, we need to get this story out to Martin Scorsese's. That is his next movie. Who would have thought, like, you do American Prohibition, call it Hatch's Navy, you get some big actors in there, it'd be great. And I've always figured if anyone had any interaction with your famous gangster, Al Capone, that might be the guy who did.
If you're looking for someone to hook you up with Hollywood, you're in the right place.
Yeah, fair enough. I didn't think of that. I'm on an LA call. Maybe there's a producer on the line right now. So any questions so far? Make sense?
Can you spend a little bit of time talking about rectification and the history of it? Because I know that that's probably a component of Canadian whiskey.
Yep.
I know that rectification back in the day was something that kind of originated the Bottled and Bond Act to kind of help preserve the integrity of the spirit. And so I'd be interested from a Canadian perspective.
It's a perfect segue. I'll do this. I'll get into that right now, and then we'll go into tasting, because I was going to go into we're going to talk about Gooderham and Worts, but not taste it yet. And then we're J.P. Weiser's, and then we'll try the deluxe. I don't want to keep you guys waiting too long. So anyone, I mean, I know you have the whiskey in front of you, the Gooderham and Worts. Is anyone familiar with the Gooderham and Worts family? Okay.
Most of us couldn't pronounce the name before you said it.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, and again, it's pretty interesting, because in Canada, you could go across the country and say Gooderham and Worts, and I'd say 95% of the people aren't going to know what you're talking about. And unless you come downtown Toronto, you're not going to see it or hear of it. Again, we don't see this in history. So, as I was saying, a lot of the English made their way over to Canada. Gooderham and Worts were 2 gentlemen. This is their last names, obviously. William Gooderham, James Worts. Were grain millers that came over from Suffolk, England, and they made their way to the town of York, which is now the city of Toronto, in the early to mid 1800s. And I should say early 1800s. And they showed up and they did exactly what they've always done. They were the guys who milled your grain. If you needed flour, if you needed your corn, or I guess it would have been wheat back then mostly, rye when the Germans showed up, milled down, they were the guys to go to. And they were very successful. They were so successful. I mean, back in the day when you would bring your grain to them, they'd grind it up into flour. You wouldn't just give them money. You'd kind of trade back some of that milled flour and money. And they had grocery stores across the city, and they would sell that flour. Well, they started producing so much flour from so many customers that it was going to waste. Rot would mildew or rot. Rodents would get into it. They were throwing it away. They were throwing their profit down the drain. So they decided, let's start distilling. And they took over a part of the city and started building everything from windmills, column stills. It's a part of Toronto. If anyone's ever been, or if you ever do come visit, I think we've got about 116 neighborhoods, and one neighborhood is called the Distillery District. And it's a neighborhood, it's big. But the thing is, the whole neighborhood is the entire distillery they built. By the year 1877, they were the largest distillery in the world. Now, how did that happen? How did they get there? When they started distilling their grain, and this is kind of getting to the question you were asking, was all people were making was moonshine in Canada at that time. That's all we knew. From building wooden column stills and taking rocks from the river, because it was right on the river, they started the double column distillation, as we call it. You know, when you think of American rye or bourbon, once column distilled, just strip away all the harsh qualities, but leave all the characteristics from the grain and yeast. They had an architect with the last name Riley, and it was actually patented. The Riley patent, it's called. They started the art of the double column distillation. So the first run, taking the spirit, all the harsh qualities out. The second run, essentially, we'll go into a distillation after, but it strips away all of the big flavors that come from the grain and the yeast. So imagine if all you've ever been drinking is moonshine, and now you've got this light, soft base whiskey, basically, made from wheat at the time, most likely. What do you think is going to happen? Like, everyone just went nuts for this. People were drinking more of this than they were drinking water. And basically, other distillers started to follow suit. And this became a thing, and it became a very Canadian thing. So when you always hear people, as I started off, saying that Canadian whiskey is always thought of as very light, soft, sometimes sweet. Sometimes, you know, when you hear the people say brown vodka, or I don't know, there's a whole bunch of other horrible things, but it's, you know, known as a very, very light spirit. And I mean, it still is today, which I'll prove that wrong with some of the stuff we're going to go through. Not all of it, but some of the whiskeys, some of the expressions. They were the ones who started off the double column distillation, and they were so successful. I mean, what did I say? Yeah, by 1877, they were producing 2.5 million gallons annually out of this downtown Toronto distillery. They were actually Canada's first taxpayers, which is pretty cool. So they were instrumental in the early days of building Toronto, the banking industry, and really building Canada's railroad as well. There were a lot of money. They were on our currency at one point. If you go through downtown Toronto, there's a lot of, all the buildings are steel and glass, and Toronto is very bad at keeping history, unlike Montreal, where it's all historic. All the buildings that are left behind here, like our Flatiron building and the big red stone mansions, those are all Gooderham buildings. So people in the city of Toronto see our history all the time, but don't actually realize what it is. It's not that well known. When you walk through this neighborhood now, it's pretty cool. It still looks like 1832. A lot of big American movies are filmed here, like when they want to be, what was it, Cinderella Man with Russell Crowe was filmed there, and you know, lots of historic films. But when you're there, you walk around and it looks like 1832. But when you go in all the shops, it's little restaurants and bars and cafes and stores to buy your dog clothes. But that's kind of how it started off. You guys want to drink some whiskey now?
Yep.
Oh, yes.
So we're just, as I was saying, traditional Canadian whiskey. I guess we should go through quick rules and regulations, because I hear a lot of people say, and I'm going to pour myself a deluxe while we're doing that. Anyone know what the rules to be a Canadian whiskey are? Pour a little bit of this right now.
Made in Canada.
You're not wrong.
Aged a minimum of 3 years.
You are correct on that. It is pretty simple. Like when I was telling the story in the beginning of the gentleman thought it was irresponsible rules, I said, not at all, actually. I said, there's, I'm not a marketer. I've never been a marketer. So for me just to say, oh my God, we're the most innovative spirit category in the world, that's bullshit. We have potential to be extremely innovative. But with our rules and regulations, I think when I'll run through it quickly, you'll understand you can be lazy too if you want. So to be Canadian whiskey, like international law, you have to use cereal grain. Canadian whiskey is generally made up of corn and rye, and obviously we use wheat and barley as well. Any cereal grain we can use, but it's most producers are using corn and rye. We must be fermented in Canada. Has to be fermented in Canada. Has to be distilled in Canada. We can distill any way we want. We can column distill, we can double column distill, we can column and pot distill, we can pot distill, but it has to be distilled in Canada. It has to be aged in Canada. And as you say, minimum of 3 years, and the law states in a wooden barrel less than 700 liters. That leaves us with all kinds of opportunities. Like Ireland and Scotland, we buy up a lot of ex-bourbon casks from you guys. So a majority of our base whiskey is aged in ex-bourbon casks. But we use brand new American oak. We use new French oak if we want more vanilla and cinnamon to it. We use every type of sherry, rums, Speyside, Black Sea cask, tequila. The list goes on. You guys can wrap your head around the different barrel finishing on that. And then it has to be a minimum 3 years in the wood. And then it has to be minimum 40% ABV, 80 proof, but we go up to big cask strengths as well. Oh yeah, I see. You know what? There's good question, Darren. I will get to that actually. I'm glad you reminded me of that. There's so much information. Sometimes I don't get to all of it. We do allow caramel coloring, as you know, a lot of whiskey categories around the world. I know, unless I know like straight bourbon and straight rye, you can't. But for consistency, we do use caramel coloring, no flavoring whatsoever. Maybe for another talk, our master blender is putting together a really great seminar on that just alone. So it's some pretty cool stuff he's putting together. But the last rule that makes it different, and then we're going to taste the whiskey and talk about it, is we have a rule called the 9.09 rule. Has anyone ever heard that? Probably not. It sounds weird.
Karai doesn't count.
What's that?
Karai doesn't count.
Yeah, fair. He's not allowed to answer. If he doesn't know. So back in the late 1800s, Canadian whiskey makers were trying to attract cognac drinkers, rum drinkers. They were trying to attract everyone to their spirit category. So they came up with this. We've got some old recipe books actually from the distillery, which is pretty cool. They came up with the 9.09 rule where you could add no more than 9.09% of a 2-year aged spirit or a wine to your blend of whiskey. And how this came about is the recipes back then were designed about around 100 liters. And they all decided the maximum spirit rule that could go in would be 10% above the total being 110%, and then 10 divided by 110 is 0.09. That's where the rule comes, hence the 9.09 rule. Now, to this day, that's still a rule. People can do that. You can put 9.09% of a aged rum, an aged bourbon, a cognac, whatever you want into the whiskey. You could put a wine in. I've never heard tell of anyone putting 9.09%. That's a lot. Now, some brands put it on their label and say, oh yeah, we've added a little bit of sherry or red wine to it. I mean, if you think about it, when you do barrel finishing, you'll get a lot of liquid coming out of a barrel finishing to do it. So some people, it makes it easier. Like we've got visitors coming over, whiskey makers from Scotland and Ireland, and they love the rule. They get such a kick out of it. They're like, oh my God, it makes it, you can do anything you want. Now, tonight, one of the whiskeys, we take advantage of the 9.09 rule, but the rest we do not. So, we might as well drink some whiskey right now. Sorry, this is taking so long. There's so much to talk about. JP Weiser's Deluxe. JP Weiser, like the Gooder Hammond Worts, was one of the founding fathers of Canadian whiskey. He was from Trenton, New York, and oh, see, I like that. Oh, and we didn't get to the, I'm going to get to the last question. We just have to drink some whiskey. This is a traditional style Canadian whiskey. This is a majority of soft double column distilled corn with a pinch of once column distilled rye. And when I say a pinch, there's probably 1% rye in this. Aged in ex-bourbon casks. Youngest blend in here would be 5 years. The oldest would be 9. And this is what's kind of it's our mixing. Canadian whiskey, traditional styles, known for mixing with like sodas or doing Boilermakers. Now, made through traditional processes, it's either number 1 or number 2 in sales across Canada every year. Crown Royal being the only thing that ever beats us in sales, which I know is very different from the US. But this is a household name across Canada.
Dave, what's the price point on this?
Karai is going to be able to answer that for the US.
I will double check that, but I think it's around 20.
I was going to say it's usually every market's roughly the same. It's under 30.
Yeah, the last time I saw it is like 24, but I will double check the California pricing for you in a second.
It's 28 at Total Wine.
Yeah,
That sounds right.
25 to 28. That's what I see on my end.
So this will be one of the lightest whiskeys we try this evening. And you know, if you're in Canada, coast to coast, and you're at bars, this is usually one of the whiskeys that's their house brand, their house whiskey. That's why sales are so great here. Their house Canadian whiskey, I should say. This one, I always get a little bit of autumn florals, you know, a little bit of caramel. I get creme brulee off this. That might sound crazy, but when I sip it, really soft, easy. There's no big punch to the mouth on this. It's your traditional light, easy sipping Canadian whiskey. To answer the question before, Canadian whiskey, when it first started, because we didn't touch on a certain topic, I'm getting off track here. When Canadian whiskey distillers were first making it, there would have been a mash bill because they were harvesting grain, they were new to it, they didn't really know what they were doing, they were learning, they were putting mostly wheat in and making whiskey. Now, as I said, the British brought over wheat to Canada. Early to mid 1800s, when you've got the Germans coming over to Canada and the US and the railways being built across Canada, the Germans brought rye with them. And this answers another question that was just asked. So back in the mid 1800s, most Canadian whiskey was being made with wheat. That's what it was known for. It was Canadian whiskey made with wheat. Rye gets introduced to Canada, largely by the Germans. Rye grows in colder climates, as I'm sure you all know. Rye grows wonderfully here in Alberta and Ontario. All of our tobacco fields are, when they're harvested, rye gets planted. We've got rye everywhere now. When distillers started introducing rye into their blends, it obviously added a lot of big, bold, spicy character to that soft wheat whiskey, and people loved it. So they actually started this is interesting how they did. So there was a mash bill done back then, and they were adding rye. They started separating the mash bills to add it in. So Canadian whiskey to this day, everything is done separately, which we'll get into. But where the term rye came from is if you would go to a bar and there were a barrel behind the bar that you would go and say, I'll have a Canadian whiskey. The bartender would pour it, and that was always the wheat whiskey. When producers started making it with rye, they would have two barrels behind the bar, and you would go in and say, I'll have a Canadian whiskey or I'll have a rye whiskey. And it was simply the rye that was being blended into the new recipes. Does that make sense? Simplest way of putting it. And that was kind of how rye whiskey was introduced into Canadian whiskey. Now we don't have the rules and regulations the same as American rye, which we'll talk about that after too. But that's where the term Canadian rye whiskey, or you look on labels and it says Canadian rye whiskey. I'm not saying it makes sense, but you could actually make a Canadian whiskey with no rye in it, and the label could still say Canadian rye whiskey. Keep that in mind. The JP Wiser's Deluxe that you're having right now, again, soft double column distilled corn, touch of rye, 1% probably put in there. Aged in ex-bourbon cask. That's what this is. That is your traditional style. If you think of the big names of Canadian whiskey, that's what it is. It's majority soft corns, touch of rye. Any thoughts?
It's very, very drinkable. I have none left. I mean, it's what you're saying, smooth, easy, but still interesting. It doesn't have the longest finish, which, you know, what are you going to do for the price point? I don't expect it to be, you know, longest thing, but creme brulee, I get that, because I do get like a little chocolate note, which I couldn't figure out, almost a coconut, but that wasn't quite it. And so creme brulee, I don't disagree with you on it. And it's interesting to me that it's mostly corn, because I would have assumed that chocolate or something came from barley or malted barley or something. But it's really, I've not had JP Weiser's, and so I'm enjoying it. And
oh, good. I'm glad.
A nice jumping off point, to be sure.
And it's you're not wrong to get those, because I mean, at the end of the day, you know, and again, maybe if Karai brings in our master blender, Dr. Don, someday, he'll sit and he can talk for 5 hours about his dissertation when he received his PhD of what wood does to whiskey. Like, he can talk for hours about it. And I mean, in the very simpler brand ambassador actor way of going into things, like, it just simply those ex-bourbon casks, which then do get turned into ex-Canadian whiskey casks. I mean, you can get a bit of that spice coming from it off this. Like, it's subtle, but it's there, as you pointed out. We should probably try the JP Wiser's 15, don't you think? I also realize you guys don't seem like you're in a rush, but I also don't want to keep you all night.
You guys have there's a 15 and then an 18, I'm saying, is that right?
Is there an 18, Karai?
In US, we had a 15 and 18. We used to have 35.
Oh, yeah, pardon me, you're asking. I thought you meant in your sample. So
No, yeah, sorry, I meant like for purchase. I apologize.
Yeah.
For purchase, we only have a 15 and 18 right currently in the US. 35, you might find it at some places. If you have connections in Michigan, I found a couple bottles the last time I went for a really good price. And dissertation, I think it was in the US for a while, a few years ago. So you might find a few bottles of that too at some certain points.
If you can find a dissertation, grab it. Actually,
Yeah.
the last tasting I did in Los Angeles was at I can't think of the name of the bar. It was in Beverly Hills, and it was a whiskey group, and it was pretty funny because I had a bottle of the dissertation on me because I was traveling and I was there in person, and there was a little bit left, and I sampled it. A gentleman got online and ordered 12 bottles from the Whiskey Exchange in London, England, I mean, there is someone in Los Angeles with some right now.
Uh,
Anyway, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the
Just a
Jeep.
second, Dave. The pricing is someone else, and 15 pricing is $45. 18 pricing is a little bit more than that, not much. And 35 can be around $250 to $300 according to the location you are.
Which I personally, again, I'm not the marketer or the sales guy. Like, it's just crazy that they price it at that. But I mean, good for everybody buying it. That's great.
And 18-year-old is like $59 if you can find it, total wine.
Cool. So we'll walk through the 15-year-old, and then I'll tell you guys about the 18-year-old if it's not here. So, you know, as we just went through the deluxe, very traditional style, being majority corn, pinch of rye, ex-bourbon casks. Now, one of the marketers around JP Weiser's 15 would tell you that it's the luxury expression of Canadian whiskey with traditional majority amount corn. I think I might even say that in the bottle or a shelf talker somewhere. So this is all true. This is also majority soft double column distilled corn and that once column distilled rye. There's two different distillates of corn aged in ex-Canadian whiskey casks and some aged in new American oak. So the ex-Canadian whiskey casks are bourbon casks that are used afterwards. So you're going to get a lot of autumn florals from that. Toffee oak, the new American oak, obviously you're going to get warming vanilla, sweet toffee and caramel off that. And then the once column distilled rye aged in ex bourbon. So, and then there's something else to talk about this. So we'll nose it and taste it first. And again, I get banana bread, I get toffee, I get the baking spices. I would get a little subtle green apple, which we'll talk about on the 18-year-old. And then the first sip. I mean, this is really soft. It's extremely smooth. You get a little bit of toffee and caramel. I get some rye spice. Certainly get like a little bit of tobacco. Now, does anyone notice anything? Oh, someone said currants. I like that. Now, and you'll know why in a minute. Is there anything unique or different from tasting this that you wouldn't normally taste in a Canadian whiskey? And if you're not getting it, it's not a bad thing. Remember how I mentioned earlier, we talk about one of the whiskeys, we take advantage of the 9.09 rule. The JP Weiser's 15, we blend in less than 2%. I like to say sherry because it comes across more romantic, but it is sherry made in Canada, so you cannot say sherry, but it's an Apera wine.
It's a fortified wine, let's say.
Yes, exactly. We do blend less than 2% of that into this as well. So that's kind of where somebody said the currants and, you know, the golden tobacco. Yeah,
So
it's got that little sweetness to it, like at the end, rich.
the age statement, what is that? Especially if there's wine blended into it, what does that mean? Everything that's in there is at least 15 years old, or
The minimum, so Canadian law, with the exception, and good, I'm glad you caught that. Canadian law is the youngest blend is what has to be on the label. So the youngest whiskey in here is 15 years. But that 9.09 rule is not part of that. So if you've got a Canadian whiskey producer, and I mean, I never speak about other brands, but there are some Canadian, I mean, there's a lot of Canadian whiskey. There's so many Canadian whiskeys sold in the US that I've never even heard of. And that's what I was talking about before, where our rules could make us extremely innovative, but also if somebody just wants to make a double, triple column distilled corn whiskey and put it in the oldest barrel ever and just age it for 3 years and 1 day and put it in a bottle, that's considered Canadian whiskey. And frankly, like when I go to states like California or Texas and I walk into a liquor store, I'll see 30 brands of Canadian whiskey that I've never even heard tell of, all for $7.99. And I think that's a big part of what hurts the Canadian whiskey industry, like those companies doing that type of thing. But we're not talking about other companies right now. So this is one where certainly recommend drinking this one on its own, sipping it neat on the rocks. This is a crowd pleaser. When I'm going to a friend's cottage or their camp and their parents are kicking around, I grab a bottle of this because it kind of pleases all ages. It's not too over the top in complexity, but it's an easy sipper. This is, as I say, kind of the crowd pleaser. Any thoughts?
No, I do like the finish on this one. It has a really good mid palate and a really good lingering finish with the sweetness of it. And it's not the deluxe. You could really, it had a much more of an alcohol kind of aftertaste to it. It's much more than an 80 proof. And this one at the same proof, it feels 10, 15 proof points lower, even though it's the same. So it's very elegant, very smooth, very, very drinkable.
I do like it. And I've got somebody just said they were at Middleton when the Lot 40 ambassador was there. Was that like 4 years ago?
Tony?
Yeah, because that was 100% me.
Yeah, that was me there.
That's hilarious.
That's whenever they had the Tua glasses.
Sorry guys, we're off topic for a minute, but basically what happened there was they were bringing Lot 40 on into the market. So they invited me to come over and do the course if I would teach there. I love that. What a small world. Nice to see you. Cheers.
Cheers.
That's hilarious. That's the first time that's happened since that trip. I love it. Sorry guys, we get off there for a minute. So I hope everyone likes the JP Wiser's 15. And now, as I mentioned, the JP Wiser's 18, which I know no one has in front of them. I don't even have any in front of me. That is a great example. And so it'll be a good segue into what we're going to do next, where Canadian whiskey, as I said, it's no mash bill. All of our grains come into the distillery on their own. Corn, rye, wheat, and barley. All the grains are fermented on their own. All the grains are distilled on their own and distilled in different ways. All the grains are aged on their own, aged in different types of casks for different amounts of time. And this is where obviously we have distillers. Our distiller at Hiram Walker is Amy. She's a rock star. She looks after all the grain programs, her and her girls. And then in Canada, we have master blenders. And the master blender, kind of the heartbeat of the distillery. They see everything from the time the grain shows up until it's being bottled. But after each grain is fermented, distilled, and aged separately, that's where they go to work. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that allows us, your traditional Canadian whiskey is soft corn with a pinch of rye. We've been through that. We also do single grains. For instance, JP Wiser's 18 is 100% corn whiskey. Most of our corn is the soft double column distilled, and that's what JP Wiser's 18 is. Soft double column distilled corn, so you get that sweet, rich corn grain, aged in, creamy flavors, aged in ex-Canadian whiskey casks for the youngest blend in the bottle is 18 years. Our master blender usually says the oldest might be 19 or 20. But this is one thing when we talk about we'll talk about it with maturation with Pike Creek, but the temperatures fluctuations and the non-temperature controlled warehouses, I can't talk. We get the chemical reaction usually around the 10-year mark of ethyl acetate. And that's basically you'll have, if somebody wants to get sciencey, they'll be like, oh, it almost smells like nail polish, but it's got kind of green apples. Some people will say pear notes to it. And the unique thing with the way this whiskey's made, where it's that soft double column distilled corn, is you actually get a lot of the green apple off of the whiskey. When you nose it, you get a little bit of green apple. Certainly when you taste it, I always get like a Granny Smith dipped in caramel. And what makes that so unique is this reaction happens to all whiskeys, but if you're having an 18-year-old or a 15-year-old bourbon, from the way it's distilled or aged, you're not going to get that acetylactate. If you're having a scotch, an 18-year-old scotch, you're certainly not getting the, well, I mean, you can get anything, but like that green apple acetylactate is not shining through from the peated barley. So what makes the JP Weiser's 18-year-old unique is you get that soft, easy sipping corn, but you kind of get that toffee Granny Smith apple to it, which is quite lovely. We'll on the next call, we'll try some of that. And I was gonna say, we're not going to go to the other single grain yet. I think we should, you guys want to try Pike Creek? Or any questions right now I should ask?
Real quick on the Weiser, I see you have a 23-year cast strength. I'm wondering sort of what your entry proof is, and then what the normal cast proof is, and when you lower it down to 40, you know, do you do chill filtration? Are you just adding water? Is there anything special you're adding to do it? Sort of that process.
Yeah, we're just, yeah, I mean, we should talk a little bit about it. Maybe we'll take a break from the drinking. Like we'll talk about, like, you know, kind of start to finish. We source all the grain locally. So it's like, we literally are grain to glass. So all of our grain, when we say local, where our distillery is located, Hiram Walker and Sons Distillery, most southern tip of Canada. And that is a 4-hour drive south of Toronto or a 45-minute flight. It is directly across the river from Detroit. When we have people at the distillery during the day doing a full tour and blending class, we just usually drive over to Detroit for the evening and stay in a hotel there, because Detroit is killing it right now at bars and restaurants. It's a really great scene. I haven't been there since I've been locked down, but point being is all of our grain we purchase comes from Ontario. But if we have a bad summer, or if we have a really wet summer and we just can't buy enough of it, we will buy from Illinois, we'll buy from Michigan if we have to. So when I say we buy local, we do buy local. Like it's in the area. It's very rare that we don't have enough to purchase from Ontario. So that's, there was a 4 summers ago, it was a wet season and couldn't buy it, but we buy all the grain. Our gatekeeper, Alice, we call her the gatekeeper. She receives about 10 to 15 truckloads a day, and she oversees it all. She's a very important person at the distillery, because if there was rot or mildew, something that would get through distillation, that master blender is going to have to deal with that 18 years later. So it's very important that she's obviously got probes and machines that assist her with this. But at the end of the day, she takes every sample from throughout the truck. Everyone that comes in, she samples from different parts of the box. And if it doesn't meet the standards, she has to send them away. And we always buy number 2 grade. Number 1 apparently is the way it was explained to me, is if you see advertisements where it's perfect corn on like a box of cereal or something, or for ads, that's where it is. Number 2 is about as good as we can get. We also recycle the corn or the grain completely. So we buy it, we make the whiskey, we have wet grain, we have dry grain that we sell back to the farmers. We're very well known for the quality of our grain. For instance, we have a few trucks that drive up from Buffalo, New York every day to buy our dry grain. And they don't bring anything to Ontario. So when you think in business sense, if you're driving for 2 hours in one of those big trucks, spending all that gas with an empty box just to buy the grain to bring back to farmers, it's not the smartest business decision, but it's good grain. So we buy about 100,000 metric tons of corn every year and 10,000 metric tons of rye, 10,000 metric tons of wheat, 10,000 metric tons of barley. And to repeat myself again, the grains show up and they stay separate until the very end when they're being blended. Needless to say, everything we're trying tonight, corn, you get the sweet, creamy flavors. Wheat, you get that toasty, bready notes. Rye provides all the bold and spiciness, and barley's that nutty flavor, which I know you all know.
How are you able to get the fermentation to take place? Because I know with bourbon and with rye, they'll throw in, or at least with bourbon, they'll throw in a little bit of malted barley to help the fermentation.
We do a little bit of malted barley, but Dr. Don is a big one on exogenous enzymes. That's most of our whiskey. Don's all about the enzymes.
Okay.
And, especially when, you're working with so much single rye, like rye on its own is such a gummy, sticky grain to deal with. So the enzymes really help cut that down and make it a lot easier to work with is kind of the best way to put it there.
Is all your rye unmalted?
Yes. Yes. Like for instance, lot 40 that you're gonna have tonight, that is 100% unmalted rye. I'm not saying we haven't had malted rye in the past, but we don't really use it as we did, mostly enzymes.
Like the famous, I mean, the recipe is 95.5, 95 unmalted, 5 malted, right? That's kind of
the
majority
original
of the
lot
industry.
40, the original lot 40 was,
Okay.
which we'll talk about tonight when we get down to the end, because it's got the most history out of everything. Now the fermentation tanks, as somebody asked earlier, I think Jordan, it was like, we have 39 fermentation tanks. They're 4 stories high. They process 40,000 gallons of spirit every day. We pitch in yeast into each batch, convert the sugar into alcohol. Corn is used as our base whiskey, as I think you guys have got already. That's 72 hours of fermentation, and it usually comes out about 15% ABV. I know Don's got it as high as 16% before, but 15% is average. For the corn and the small grains, the rye, barley, and wheat, it's 60 hours, and that comes out at 8% ABV. It's a pretty cool sight to behold, to walk through it all. It is a very warm room with 39 fermentation tanks going. Usually when we host people, and I'd love if we could host you one day, is everyone shows up and we have a night of dinner and drinks, and then we do the tour and another night of dinner and drinks, everyone leaves. I try to warn everyone. I'm like, just mind yourself how much you can consume on the first night. Everyone's a grown up, but generally if somebody's had a little too much, that room that we're in for an hour is not a pleasant place to be if you're feeling a little hungover from the night before. But I know that wouldn't happen with you guys because you're professionals.
And this is located in Toronto, you said?
It's in Windsor, Ontario. So it's just a 4-hour drive.
Just a 4-hour drive.
That's a 4-hour drive. It's, if you're visiting and we're in Toronto, it's a 45-minute flight. So it's about depending on the border, it's a half an hour drive to Detroit. So we always, I'd like to say we Uber over, but that's tougher. I've got a great guy who runs a little bus company, and he just, it's called the Party Bus, and he just waits for us wherever we are, and we hop in and we drive across the border for dinner and drinks. It's nice. Now, as I mentioned before, we'll talk distillation for a minute, then we'll do maturation, and we'll have some Pike Creek. The rules are we don't restrict methods of distillation in Canada or the alcohol strength of the spirit. Really, it's, we talked earlier, a lot of our whiskey will run to the beer still, and the one pass, it's that tall copper, it's 65 feet in height, 6 feet across, and it's got how many 55 copper trays, about 100 holes per tray. So that's two of the ones where like the rye and the corn go through. And you know, once column distilled, I don't know if I touched on this before, the once column distilled comes out at 70% ABV, and it goes into the barrel about 58% ABV. So that's the way we'd make a lot of the once column distilled rye, for instance, that would have been blended in to the first JP Weisers that you had. And then after we do the extraction and rectification, that goes back in, we dilute it down to about 14%. And then the second pass of the column still, it comes out after double column distilled, 94 to 95% ABV. And that is your base whiskey that we're doing, a lot of the corn that you had in the two JP Weisers. And that goes into the barrels at 76 ABV is what that would do. And that's the way all of our base whiskey's made, that double column distillation. The once column distillation generally for a lot of our ryes, but we also do pot distillation. And we do have, we've got 3 pot stills, sorry, 4 right now. We've got a new one for R&D, but the lot 41, everything that's put through it is strictly just that once column distilled rye goes into it. And it's an 8,000 liter pot still. So it's not huge. It's a 12-hour process. So we've got, so it's a lengthy time so we can really do exact cuts. And I know that I'm talking to the right group when I'm talking heads, hearts, tails. You know, what we do for the lot 40 particularly is our master blender, Don, takes the heads, which are the green grass notes, he discards of those. Tails being all the soapy characteristics, he discards of those as well. We sell them to an ethanol plant down the way, but he keeps all of that, all the hearts with that rye, and that's giving you all your floral and sour rye, or sorry, sour rye bread, baking spices, that big bold rye grain. That's how it's concentrated up, which we're going to do lot 40 at the end, so we'll talk more about that when we get there. But we should probably try some Pike Creek now, don't you think?
Definitely, let's do it.
Got the little my bottle's almost empty here. I got enough to try some tonight with you guys though. So as I mentioned before, the distillery being in one of the most southerly tip of Canada. It's obviously I don't have a presentation tonight. Cora and I were talking about keeping it a little more casual this time, and then maybe the next one we'll really geek out, bring on Dr. Don and do all the slides. But if later on, if you want to Google like Windsor, Ontario, you'll see around the Great Lakes, it's the part that dips down. It's literally like almost not across from Kentucky, but my point being is it goes down so south that it's the one part of Canada. If you're there in the distillery with me and we need to go to the US, we're in Canada and we have to drive north to get to America. And it kind of messes you up when you sit there and you think that. You're like, I'm in Canada.
There you go.
Cool, let's get the screen sharing.
Yep. So this is Windsor. And
yeah, see how close Detroit is?
Yep. I was pretty surprised when I saw Canada was on south.
And Detroit's close enough that there is a bridge you can see there, but there's a tunnel underneath. We usually just drive under the tunnel, underneath the water.
This one is the tunnel, right?
That's the tunnel. Yeah, exactly. So that's where we go over. And if you actually, you can, yeah, the distillery's not far over, but all along the water, it is a large distillery. And then I don't know if you can zoom out to show the tip of Windsor at all, like in the Canada America map, or maybe not.
I'm just trying to zoom out now.
Yeah, so it's like
This
Right,
is a
man.
tip.
So point being, down there in that part of Canada, temperatures are extremely unique. And I mean, if you want to talk about some of the other big Canadian whiskey distilleries, I think we all know the name, like Crown Royal. It's up north in Manitoba, so it's up in a real colder area. They've got nice summer months and stuff, but I dare say that we've got some of the most unique climate. I mean, we've got, first of all, it's 16 warehouses that hold 1.6 million barrels of whiskey, as I was mentioning. The barrels are stacked 6 pallets high, and it's 600 barrels per row. The angel share annually is 3%, which equals out to 48,000 barrels of whiskey that go missing every year. And again, when you get to talk to Don, he takes it a step further. It's the distillery works for 2.5 weeks for free every year from the lost evaporated whiskey, is how he has it figured out, which is why you do love him for many reasons. But by law, as I said before, Canadian whiskey has to be aged a minimum of 3 years in a wooden cask under 700 liters. We buy up a lot of ex-bourbon casks. No restrictions to the type of wood, which leaves us for, as I said before, I always like to go back to this. It's not great marketing, but it's like, if you just wanted to have an old wooden barrel, you could age whiskey in it. Which, doesn't sound great. I hope no one does that. But, with us, we're very much like, there's a purpose to it. Ireland, like same way Ireland and Scotland buys up ex casks as well. We finish in rum, we finish in Speyside, we finish in tequila. Like, I went into it before. You can go on and on in the types of barrels we finish in, or what he has laying down right now. I don't even think Karai knows. There's some crazy stuff that's going to come out in the next few years, I hope, as long as brand teams allow it. Now, what you're having now is the Pike Creek. This starts off in a real traditional method. I'm assuming can anyone repeat what a real traditional method for Canadian whiskey is right now? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Dave is ready to go.
Mostly corn, 1% rye, aged 3 years.
Yeah, there you go. So it's like,
Perfect.
it's and I mean, I don't ever like to say 1% rye because someone might be 5%, but it's a really small percentage of rye. So soft corn. This is a very sweet, soft whiskey. Probably the sweetest whiskey we have. It is majority corn, a little bit of rye, aged in ex-bourbon cask for minimum 10 years. That's how this starts off. But afterwards, for instance, I don't know if anyone would be familiar with it because it's not sold in the US, but we also make a rum called Lamb's Rum. Does very well in Canada and does exceptionally well in the UK. All those barrels are brought up from Guyana. We blend the rums, make a rum, and we've got all the ex casks. So Dr. Don takes this corn whiskey and rye whiskey after it's been aged in ex-bourbon casks, and he finishes it in the rum casks. And with that, I mean, you're kind of getting this, it's almost like a polished copper. At least that's what I see. I was getting like that, again, kind of the golden raisin, a little bit of honey, certainly some brown sugar. You get that faint green apple as the apple acetate we talked about before. And this is sweet, it's rich.
Dave, is there anything added to that?
Caramel coloring?
The 9.09.
No.
Okay.
And I mean, you'd almost think so because, and I've asked Dawn before, I was like, wouldn't it just be easier to just put, if you want to take advantage of the rule, but for this one in particular, he's got the ex rum cast there anyway. He's got to use them.
That's where I think I'm getting the sweetness from.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I get like the Christmas cake off this. Like, a lot of people say maple. I think that's is stuck in their minds with Canada, but it's like brown sugar. You get the island spices. I mean, I at least I get rum notes off of this. I taste a little bit. Like this certainly is a sipper. Real easy to sip on, almost dangerously easy. And one thing that I'm not a fan of is when whiskey companies or spirit companies try to push onto the bartender, the consumer, what they should do with the whiskey. I prefer when it happens naturally on its own. And one thing we've noticed with bartenders, at least across Canada, parts of the US, different parts of Europe, two things happen with this whiskey. And you tell me if it makes sense. Summer months, they're muddling up herbs, fresh juices, crushed ice, and they're kind of doing tiki style cocktails, spice syrups with this. And in the colder months, I see lots of coffee and dessert cocktails. Vanilla syrups, cinnamon syrups, egg whites, coffee. And it works beautifully when it comes to that. So it's lovely on its own, but it's really nice in cocktails as well. Any fans of the Pike Creek? Oh, I like that.
Yeah, no, it was really good. I would have put money on the fact that there was something added to it to kind of have that sweetness to it, but having the rum barrel finish makes a lot of sense. I was had my first JP Weiser bottles pushed on me.
Oh yeah.
A concierge at Pavilions, and she pushed on me 2 bottles of the 23 and 2 bottles of the 35.
Oh wow.
And I have to say that the 23 at cast strength, because as a few other people here, Jordan, are a big clear rock, drinker.
Mm-hmm.
And so the 23 was exceptional on a big cube.
Amazing. I love that. Yeah, that's a cast strength one. There's a 22 and the 23. Is it the just one of the it's the 22 that's the port finish, I think.
Yeah, this is the 23 cast strength blend, rare cast series, blended Canadian whiskey, 64.3.
Yeah. And the next year they did 22-year-old and they finished it in port casks, which is really nice. Dawn's been it's really nice actually.
Well, the packaging is beautiful. I mean, the bottle's gorgeous.
I was gonna say,
it's a nice square feel to it. It is really impressive.
It's funny because I mean, this like the standard guide, this bottle's new. It used to be rounded, and it's become a little more, I don't know, old school, timeless classic, and I'm really liking it more. But these ones are hard to beat. Like they're pretty good bottles. Like thick glass. Like they're nice looking. Yeah, I'm glad that Karai and I talked about it. I'm glad some of the rare expressions are making their way down to the US. So hopefully more of that will happen. I mean, it's like anything else. If you guys are buying it and drinking it, then we'll have more call to bring more down. We'll be asked to, we need to be invited to bring more. We'd love to sell everything down there, but we got to make sure it moves.
You guys are too polite to insist.
Well, and I mean, yeah, you're probably right. But I mean, it's like, it's like anything else. If we've got a real small run of something, problem being before is that we'd usually just sell in Canada and it wouldn't leave the country. But now we're trying to, for instance, my export team, there's 4 of us. It's not my team, but I'm part of it. We're trying to always sneak some away from the limited releases to bring down to the US, even if it's 200 bottles, just to get something down across the border to sell to you guys. And you'll see when we do this live someday, I'm usually toting 1 or 2 things in a backpack that I pull out to surprise you at the end, which obviously I can't do tonight, unfortunately. So any questions on the Pike Creek?
Is the Pike Creek just the one expression?
No, great question. So it's past its history. It originally came out in the 90s as a port finish. It changed over in 2015 or 16. And the honest to God non-marketing response was it was becoming very hard to get the port casks and they were becoming extremely expensive. And we had these rum casks sitting at the distillery. And when we tried it, we're like, this works really well, we thought. So that's the non-marketing answer of how it happened. But like the rum finish is our standard. But every year we release a 21 or 22-year-old Pike Creek limited edition. We've released a Speyside finish. We've released a Hungarian and French oak finish. We released an Oloroso finish last year, which won Best Canadian Whiskey. And we just released a 22 PX Sherry finish, which I gotta say, I think is my favorite out of them. And yes, all in Pike Creek. So Pike Creek, as you can imagine, it is our story of maturation. Actually, the name Pike Creek, which I didn't get to, is there is a Pike Creek by our storage facilities. It is a very small creek. None of the water from it is used in our whiskey, but it is where the name Pike Creek comes from because this is truly, it's our one story of maturation out of all of our standards whiskeys. It's always finished in different barrel types.
And all of these distilleries are all in that one area, right?
Well, I mean, the distilleries across Canada, there's 300 across Canada.
No, I'm saying the ones we're discussing today.
Oh, yes. We own and make all of these at our distillery, 100%. Yeah.
And so it's one distillery in Windsor, or it's multiple distilleries?
One. So Hiram Walker, and again, it's a great segue. Hiram Walker Distillery. Hiram Walker, I didn't talk about Hiram Walker because we don't have a brand after him, but Hiram Walker was also an American like J.P. Weiser. And Hiram Walker was from Boston, but he lived in Detroit and he had a grocery store. If you go to Detroit, where the big GM building is, that's roughly where his grocery store was. Now he was like J.P. Weiser's. It was really inventive. He was doing something no one else was doing at the time. And we have notes, some of his notes and books on it, but he doesn't really say why he started. He was taking moonshine and he was filtering it through charcoal and selling it at his grocery stores in Detroit. Kind of like a Brita water filter almost. Like none of his notes that we have says where he came up with the idea of why he was doing it, but he was doing it. He made some money. He saw the Civil War on the rise. He saw prohibition, rumors of prohibition. When it came time to him saying, I'm gonna open a distillery, he wasn't doing it in America. He was the first commuter, as we always say. He came across on boat. He never lived in Canada. He came across by boat and he built his distillery, which opened up in 1857. And we've been making whiskey there ever since. I mean, it's crazy to think because, I mean, we're relatively unknown brands. We're not like, we're a household name in Canada, but we're certainly not known in the US. But J.P. Weiser, for instance, was one of the first labeled whiskeys at the Chicago World Fair in 1900. Or to think that J.P. Weiser's has been produced longer than Jack Daniels is like mind-blowing to me.
You guys also own Canadian Club.
Yes, 100%. Canadian
That's
Club.
crazy.
Canadian Club's made there. When I say that we're one of the largest distilleries in North America and we bottle about 5 million cases a year, fact of the matter is a little over 1 million of those cases would be our whiskey. The other 4 million, that's not, we're a big factory. We produce a lot of things for other people. And, you know, some I can talk about. I mean, I wouldn't talk about other people's whiskeys, but I mean, we make Malibu rum there, for instance. And we make some gins, and we make a lot of liqueurs for people. So it's like there's a lot of crazy stuff that comes out of this big factory, but there's also the, you know, the small side of things when you get your 8,000 liter pot still making lot 40. We've got a little, I don't know if I want to say craft side to it, but a little craft side to it. A lot of R&D going on. And we have 1,300 barrels come and go from our drain and fill every day in an 8-hour shift. That's a lot of barrels, but we also have an area where it's all hand-filled barrels. So it's, we have the capabilities of doing small craft in there, but obviously very large quantities of spirit for ourselves and other companies.
All I heard was you say that when you meant rum cask, you meant Malibu rum cask. Got it. That's where all the sweetness came from.
There, all jokes aside, there's well, I guess jokes aside, there's when I take people through the you know, it's like 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. with the blending course included. It's a long day to get through everything. And towards the end of all the whiskey stuff, I walk people into this one room and you just watch everyone's face because it just smells like coconut. And it's the room where all the Malibu rum is being made. So it's pretty funny. I guess we should try the Gooder Ham and Worts. Now, I'm really curious. I want to know how you guys are gonna feel about this. I want to get a conversation going. I want feedback on it. It's this kind of nice little bottle here.
That's the one that's the 4 grain, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
So you've heard me mention marketing quite a few times in this. And you know what? I guess I'm almost a little obsessed with it. Like I say, before I started this role, you know, I was a bar and restaurant owner that got to go to a lot of distilleries over the years, and you know, but never ever worked with another brand before in my life. That's a lie. John Glazer used to hire me to do Compass Box stuff, but this is the first whiskey company I've ever really worked for. I was blown away with, you know, how much goes into the whiskey making from the marketing teams. It's very impressive. For instance, I gave you the history of the Gooder Ham and Worts boys, who, like, you know, started the double column distillation and helped build the city of Toronto. Also, which we didn't talk about, is this is one of the distilleries that got really destroyed by American Prohibition. Never really came back. Ended up making a lot of like ammunition for World War II. Like the distillery did a lot of things, but long story short, in the 1990s, it shut down. And when I say it's a massive neighborhood in Toronto, it was like locked down in the 90s for about 10 years. Here's one, and this is me aging myself, but I'm gonna guess there's someone on the call that will know this. Has anyone ever seen the movie Tommy Boy with Chris Farley, David Spade? Anyone ever see that? Okay, so Tony, you know Callahan Auto Parts in that movie? That's Gooder Ham and Worts Distillery in downtown Toronto. That was kind of when it was shut down. So it was like they just used all the places because it was a vacant wasteland. Some people with deep pockets came back into reconstruct this, and it took about 10 years to bring it back to life. And right now it is stunning. Like, it's where a Christmas market is. It is just gorgeous. With that revival of the Gooder Ham and Worts Distillery, the distillery district, not the distillery itself, but the neighborhood, a young guy at Corby, he was in his late 20s on the marketing team, pitched to the company to revive the whiskey because we own the rights to it. And when it got brought to our master blender's attention, he was like, that's a great idea. He's like, if I'm going to do it though, Gooder Ham and Worts were grain millers. They were constantly milling wheat rye, corn, and barley for people. He said, I want to make a 4-grain whiskey. And as you know, I mean, I think it's safe to say back in 2015, it was 4 grains were certainly not something common in Canada. And I don't even know how common they were in the US. But to do a 4-grain whiskey was pretty unique. You know, the first year it came out, World Whiskey Awards gave it Best Canadian Whiskey, which was pretty cool. And it is simple. Sorry, it's not simple. It's the opposite of simple. It's our most complex blend because it's 4 grains, but 7 distillates. It's a majority amount of soft double column distilled corn with an almost equal amount of a column and pot distilled rye. And then you got a column and pot distilled wheat and column pot distilled barley. You got a column barley, column wheat as well, and a column rye. And it's aged in 2 types of casks, ex-bourbon casks and New American oak are the 2 casks that make it up. It's bottled at 44.4 ABV because Don was feeling cheeky that day, and his 4 grain is 44.4 ABV. Now, out of all of our whiskeys, I find for myself, this is one that when I nose it and drink it, I literally kind of walk through the grains. I always get that, like, you know, fresh baked bread from the wheat almost. Certainly like a little touch of roasted nuts from the barley. I get a bit of red apple, some dried spices and honey. It's got a full mouthfeel, I think. And, you know, little caramel and toffee naturally coming from the new oak. But you always get that like warming kind of rye spice, which you don't get off all Canadian whiskeys. This is a good majority amount. It's almost half rye. I love this one. I think it's perfect to sip on its own. And generally, you see people sip this on its own, but also bartenders, you could imagine if a bartender's making a classic with this, it makes a nice Manhattan because it's that big corn and rye. It's obviously bartenders like using it to make a Toronto cocktail, a bitter Manhattan. But this is a nice sipper. Now, as Americans, what do you guys, and I mean, is there anyone that's not a fan? Do I have any fans of this, or any bourbon fans that like this, or, you know, that someone might not like the traditional Canadian whiskey style? And I'm asking in all seriousness, because this is something I'd like to see us push a little bit more.
Yeah, I like it. As more of a bourbon guy, I definitely feel like it hits those notes a little more than the previous Canadian whiskeys have. Not to say that the 15-year wasn't great, because I did like the 15-year quite a bit. But yeah, this one has more of a bourbon-esque kind of flavor profile to it, which I like, and I can relate to an extent.
I'm glad to say that, because I mean, Karai's listened to Gina and I talk way too many times where I'm even impressed he's still here right now. Before lockdown and COVID, we only had this in the US market less than a year. So there's this limited amount of people that I got to taste it with. But I love that you just said that, because we had so many people coming up and going, I'm generally a bourbon drinker. I'm not a rye drinker. I certainly don't drink Canadian whiskey, but I'll drink this. And we noticed bourbon drinkers were coming up and pointing this out to us, which obviously, if bourbon drinkers like it, that's a pretty good thing in the US. So I appreciate you saying that as well.
So I'm typically a rye drinker, but I found this one to be, the most complex of what we tasted so far. I guess I found it to be very elemental, almost as though I could kind of taste the different components. So, you know, I almost felt like I could taste rye or taste corn. Really kind of interesting and really kind of unique. Definitely, I would drink it.
I thank you, and I'm glad you feel that way. And I feel 100% the same with you. Out of all the whiskeys, it's just that I'm like, I can actually, like, whether it's nosing, tasting, I walk through all the grains.
Yeah, it wasn't like
In my
sweet like the
mind.
others. It was almost like I was chewing on cereal. I mean, I felt like I was, just yeah, concentrated grain is what I thought. It was very good.
And when I brought up that this is kind of a marketing whiskey, the beauty with this is, marketers came up with this concept. Our master blender said, loved it. He went with it, made this. Now, what's happened since, like the Pike Creek and the Lot 40, we do annual releases with Gooderham and Worts as well. So we've done Gooderham and Worts Little Trinity, which is Little Trinity is a church in downtown Toronto that was built by William Gooderham in the late 1800s. It's still a functioning church. But again, marketing, we're like Little Trinity and we get a 4-grain whiskey. They pulled out one of the grains and made a different recipe with 3 grains to be the Little Trinity, which I thought was amazing. Sitting around, and this is where you realize like how marketing can influence. True story, sitting around with the director of Canadian whiskey in Detroit one night and a few bartenders, and our master blender was with us. We started having too many drinks and we started talking about weird things you could do and stories. And someone brought up the story of when William Gooderham took a boat overseas from the UK to Canada. A lot of people died, like from scurvy and disease, like adults. To long story short, with his children and some children along the way, when he got to Canada, he was very wealthy. He adopted 11 children and raised them. He adopted 11 children. Very well known from that. The family's grown and it's a big Canadian thing. But we were talking about that story. And as we're going on, our master blender looks at us and he goes, I think I can do it. And we're like, think you can do what? And he goes, I think I figured it out, but I need to actually go try it. And we're like, what? He goes, an 11 distillate whiskey. And we're like, of course you can. So that year we put out Gooderham and Worts 11 Souls, and it was an 11 distillate whiskey. It sold out overnight, that one. So that's, and we've done other expressions where we base it off one of the buildings they have. And it's a really fun whiskey to play around with that. But we got to keep moving here. So we have one more whiskey to get through. This is the reason I'm here, folks. Lot number 40. As I said in the beginning, I sold enough of this at my 2 spots. The company actually came by to see what the hell was going on. Now, as a nerdy cocktail bartender all those years ago, as you'd imagine, sure, I sold a lot of Canadian whiskey, but I was using more American rye, the very little I could get here in Ontario, or bourbons, bigger styled whiskeys to make my classic cocktails with. And when Lot 40 came out, that changed things a bit for me. It's got a bit of a history, which I'll tell quickly because I see our time's running out. Lot 40 originally came out in 1998. And someone mentioned, it might have been you, David, someone mentioned before the recipe was different, which I'll tell you. Now, traditional Canadian whiskey, that's soft corn, little bit of rye. Our previous master blender, Michael Booth, in the 90s, came up with the idea, because all of our grains are fermented, distilled, and aged separately. You have the ability to do almost anything you want. He pitched to the company, what if we take that rye that we just put such a small amount of into the corn whiskeys and put 100% rye out on the market? Company loved the idea. They gave it a shot. They named it Lot 40 because Michael Booth's 7th generation forefather was a distiller as well. And when he moved to Canada from the UK, he was given a plot of land by the distillery, which was lot number 40. Now, the funny thing of that is that you guys have learned I'm not a marketer. We know from document that he was given a plot named lot number 40. We just don't know where it is. But that's where the name Lot 40 came from. Late 90s, I bartended in a lot of places around the world. One thing was in common: drinks and glasses shaped like this, neon juicy cocktails, vodka-based Sex in the City ruled the airwaves. Everyone, that's what people were into. What do you think happened when we released 100% rye whiskey back then? Failed. Failed.
I was going to say not much.
Failed. Here's the deal. Failed so badly, no one at the distillery or company saved a bottle of the original Lot 40. Now, I found a couple bottles in an old liquor store in Rome, Italy, 3 summers ago, and brought them to the distillery. So now they have some, but and I saved one for myself to compare. Fast forward to the 2000s. Bartenders in London, England, and New York City start bringing out old classic cocktail books and doing brown, stirred cocktails. Bourbon explodes around the world. Irish whiskey then explodes around the world. Japanese whiskey explodes around the world. Don Draper and the Mad Men crew replace Sex in the City, and everybody wants a martini or a Manhattan for lunch. Boom. Consumers are into whiskey again all of a sudden. When someone at the company, I don't know who, someone just said, yeah, I got the hype push. Someone at the company said, what if we bring back that 100% rye whiskey? Our master blender at the time now, Dr. Don, was like, I'd like to take a crack at it and make 100% rye whiskey, but with a different component. The original Lot 40 was 5 to 10% malted rye, the rest unmalted rye, aged in ex-bourbon casks. That's what original Lot 40 was. Dawn's was 100% unmalted, column pot distilled, aged in brand new oak. Now, when we released that in 2012, the rye that failed miserably won Best Canadian Whiskey at the Canadian Whiskey Awards that year. Like, crazy. It won 2 years later, it won it again. The year that Jim Murray chose Crown Royal Rye to be his favorite whiskey in the world. Oddly enough, the next week, Lot 40 won Best Canadian Whiskey in the world. So there was a whole, you can imagine the conflict in the marketing departments. It was kind of funny, but that's when people started taking notice. That's when I started taking notice. That's when my job started. And going around the world with it now, we're seeing bartenders use it like crazy. Like, it is, we should probably try it.
As we're trying it, I do want to take a second to get everyone to raise a glass. Hopefully they still have some left in their glass before you all kill it. This is quite enjoyable. I did not mean to interrupt you, Dave, but as we're nearing the end, I want to take a second to say thank you. Thank you to Karai for helping organize this. Thank you to you, Dave, for spending the evening with us. This has been absolutely fantastic and super educational, and exactly what I was looking for. I didn't know anything about Canadian whiskey and wanted to learn, and this has been exactly that. So thank you so much. Everyone raise a glass, smile to your camera, and say cheers. Perfect. So thank you.
Cheers. It was great. Yeah, and this kind of wrapping up the story of this, like, you know, deep, rich amber color. I get lots of that sour rye bread. Kind of warm honey, certainly vanilla. You get that floral from me, the hearts. And then, I mean, you get the heavy rye spice. I mean, it's that bold, spicy rye, but it's got a real kind of soft elegance to it too. I mean, one thing I love about American rye is it kind of punches you in the jaw. This is a little more of a love slap. So it's certainly
that, Dave, because there's a certain person that's usually always here on these virtual tastings asking about, you know, higher proofed expressions. Is the rye done in a higher proof?
Right now we've released, okay, so the Lot 40, again, we release different versions every year. We put out a 12-year-old cast strength one year. Then we did an 11-year-old cast strength. Then we did a non-age statement cast strength because Don did 2 blends of cast strength. He did American oak, but he did a much younger age straight rye aged in new French oak. He put out just recently, so recent, I don't think Karai's even got a bottle. He did cast strength finished in peated quarter casks. And he also put out Lot 40 Dark Oak last year. And this is a nice segue. That's coming to America. I want to say the summer, but it might be next fall.
Let's say.
We're trying to get in as quick as we can. Dark Oak is simple. It's Lot 40 that is aged in.
So, Dave, I'm sorry, you just lost me. Because I was wondering, because I really like the rye. Do you have what's your highest proof rye expression that you have? Because this is exceptional.
Yeah. Oh, and that's what I'm about to get to.
Yeah. Okay.
So the Dark Oak, which is coming to the U.S., it's 48 ABV, where this is 43. And it won at the World Whiskey Awards last year. It won best rye in the world.
Well, 48's not cast strength though, right? It's just higher proof.
No. This is not one of our cast strength versions.
Oh, okay.
Cast strength is an annual, like, couple thousand bottles made. That's it. This is going to be a full-time introduction to the Lot 40 world.
But those cast strengths with all those finishes, did you distribute those in the US, or they were so limited you only did it in Canada and the distillery? Or
the 12 and 11 year was not in Canada. The non-age statement was in Binny's, for instance, in Chicago. Sold a lot of it. They bought a lot from us, but
they don't ship anymore.
Yeah, fair enough.
I will be in Chicago on Wednesday.
All right, I'll give you a list.
And I was going to say, if we get to do this in person too, you can count on me bringing some treats along to make up for missing out on this one as well. So I've always got something kicking around that you can't buy anymore.
We have multiple venues that we could be happy to coordinate hosting.
Perfect. I love that.
We should get you to a warmer place, Dave, as soon as possible.
As soon as they let me hop on a plane, you're not going to see me in Canada again. I'm just going to be traveling. I can't wait.
Love it.
So any thoughts or questions on this? I would say, to finish it off, this is one that we see a lot of bartenders using it in classic cocktails.
The price point.
Coming down. I was checking for something else at the moment. So we have different prices for this, but maximum price I saw in the market is $40, guys, in California. So it's an amazing purchase, and it has been one of my favorite ryes over the year since I came to the US, honestly. And what I love more, Dave, I would have to say this about the cast strength version of this one. Oh my gosh.
Stop it. You can't do that. Jesus.
It's just unbelievable.
You suck.
I do. Dave, one question. The quarter cast finish one you said, what's going to be the ABV on that one? Did I miss it?
Just bear with me.
Of course. We would love to see the bottles. So.
I don't want to lie to you guys, so I wanted to double check. That is 55.5 ABV. That's peated.
That's better.
And
Wait, did you say peated?
Yeah, peated quarter cast. And then this is the dark oak.
A rye in a peated quarter in a peated quarter cap?
Yeah. Wow. Let's see if you can read it. It's quite lovely. So it's called Rye Explorations. It's a new thing that I think they're going to try it. So every year we should be getting some interesting, for instance, I have a little sample of Lot 40 cast strength finished in port casks right now. And it's pretty nice.
Oh,
And
geez.
We'll take one of those.
Yeah.
there's one in a Madeira, and there's one in a Black Sea cat. Like he's got some fun stuff happening. So I hope this does well, because if it does, we'll be able to see a lot more come out.
But who
Dave,
are the
you noticed? Go ahead.
who are
Dave.
the retailers that are stocking this Karai? Is it Cano and Mission and
Currently, they're not here yet, so we have some time to see that. We don't know the allocation. We are waiting for all the imports yet.
If only there was a local person who could make sure that distribution would be good in LA.
Yeah, we'll see. It's up to where I live, you know that, guys. But I will definitely let you know. But if I know California a little bit, we will have KNL, Mission, probably Remedy. Those three will have sufficient amount of those.
Mission is the only one that has most of these right now on hand.
Yeah. KNL used to have everything that we brought in. It's sold out now, and Remedy is becoming a better store for us every now and then. So I would say Mission definitely, KNL definitely, and the others will look at it. But like I will shout out when it comes anyway, so don't worry about it.
yeah, because the lot 40 in any kind of a finishing expression, whether it's even if it's peated or particularly if it's in a sherry or a Madeira finish, that would be really exciting to try.
Dave, people are asking for the vintage JP Wisest.
I totally forgot about that. So yeah. Port. I don't have any. I can't. I'll just.
I don't have any either. I gave everything.
So I'll tell you what. I'll tell you about it, but I'll tell you. I think my funniest story around it. And if you have to drop off, because I realize we're probably past our time, but when I started with the gig, at my bars, I wasn't selling flavored whiskeys. We were not that type of place, and nothing against any that are. I love them, but I never really ever had to speak to the flavored whiskeys. And when I was doing stuff in the US, the Pernod Ricard team who we worked with at the time would always say, "Hey, can you talk about the JP Weiser spiced?" I was like, "I guess I can," but I was very selective on the type of establishments you'd go in. And it's simple. It is a 3 to 4 year corn whiskey, like 3 year soft double column distilled corn. You can't add sugar to Canadian whiskey, but you can add it to flavored Canadian whiskey. So we add sucrose. I think it's like 8% sucrose added, and then the flavor, we have a vanilla, we have an apple, we have a toffee. That's made at a flavor house, and it's added in after blending. So it's that basic. But I remember being at a whiskey show in Texas, and I walked out, and there was this big guy. I'm 6'2", 220 pounds. I'm not little. And this guy just made me look petite. And he had that cowboy hat and everything. And he goes, pardon my French here, everyone. He goes, "Why the fuck do all you whiskey companies keep making all of these flavored whiskeys?" And I kind of smiled and I looked at him and I said, "You want the honest answer?" And he goes, "Yeah." I was like, and I backed up a little bit. I was like, "Because of you." And he was like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Canada and America, we guzzle this flavored, we guzzle so much flavored whiskey that the companies are never going to stop making it." Now, mind you, we stopped making that spiced whiskey, that JP Weiser's one. It didn't do so well. But funny enough, I mean, as you're nosing it now, tasting it, it's been years since I've had it. I had a girl, somebody in Denver. She ended up being our best salesperson for JP Weiser spiced whiskey. Or sorry, best customer. And I had to go see her and see what the hell she was doing with it. And what she was doing was she had a coffee stout porter on tap, and she'd serve the vanilla flavored whiskey with it as a Boilermaker. And it was her house special. And people flew through it. And it was pretty tasty.
Oh.
So you got a poll up there. I like that.
Yeah, this one's gonna be a tough one.
It's okay, David. You can vote for the spiced whiskey. We're not going to judge you.
I already did.
All right. So, Dave, I had a question for you. It's interesting to me that you mentioned that with Canadian laws, it only states that it has to be aged in an oak cask, right, up to 700 liters. So,
And not even that, in a wooden cask.
yeah, in a wooden cask. So, are you playing around with any? Because Canada's a big country, and I'm sure there's a lot of forests. Are you playing around with any Canadian wood? You've got. I mean, that's the first thing to think of.
It's a great question. I mean, easy answer is there's not really any companies that make Canadian oak barrels.
Okay.
Now,
There's no cooperages in Canada.
no, and no one's buying the wood to make it. And the way it was explained to me, because it was one of the first questions I had too. I was like, why aren't we using new Canadian oak to try out? But apparently it's not as porous. It doesn't breathe the same. Like there have been barrels made from Canadian oak.
Mhm.
If Don was here, he'd be able to give a much more detailed answer on it, being the wood master. But it just, at the end of the day, it doesn't work as well. It doesn't breathe as well. There's 40 Creek, I believe. It's their Federation Oak. I think they've done it before. But other than that, I've not even really heard of any Canadian whiskey companies doing it.
No maple casks coming out.
No.
That would be like super Canadian.
Absolutely, it would be.
Maple cask kicked down the street by a moose. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to close out the poll just for fun. Dave, what do you think was the favorite sample tonight?
I'm gonna guess, and again, I don't know all your palate snuff, but I'm gonna say if it was, I'm gonna go in between, maybe on the higher end, lot 40, but then I'd be curious to see how people reacted to the JP 15.
Okay, and Karai knows our palates pretty well by now. Karai, you want to take a guess?
It's just lot 40 always has a special place with me. I would want to say so. I will say lot 40.
Okay.
But I am also big, JP 15 lover.
For sure. All right, so the results are tied for first place, lot 40 and Pike Creek 10.
There you go.
Came out of nowhere.
Okay.
So it was 4 votes for each, and then 2 votes each for the JP Weiser 15 and Gooderham and Warts. So,
No spice whiskey. Come on.
David
Just
tried
making
to
me
click
sad.
that one. He just missed by accident.
And
He clicked
Karai,
lot 40.
well, when you go to Chicago, you should ask the person you're visiting if he's going to make a spiced whiskey and see what he says.
Well, honestly, I will be with Paul Jones, so he's never gonna make that.
I didn't say it. I didn't say it. You did.
But they're making some gin, FYI. Currently.
That spiced whiskey is a special kind of awful. But,
Yeah,
it
it
was,
was.
it was really fun, and the nose I got on it as soon as I started nosing it, I couldn't put my finger on it, and then I looked over and I found a Sharpie marker, and I'm not lying, it's the exact same smell, like the exact same smell.
Well,
Well,
the other
Dave
thing
said
too-
they allow coloring into the whiskey, so that's how they did it.
the other thing too is like that hasn't. Is it like that hasn't been?
It's a plastic bottle. I think it's pretty old. Like
I was gonna say it hasn't been made since I've worked for the company, so that's minimum.
That's a really old one, guys.
That's
I love it.
8 or
It was
9
very
years
fun.
old.
I just sent it to you because you can appreciate the other whiskeys more now. You're always drinking good stuff, guys. Come on.
I'll like I say, when we get to do this in person, I'll make sure I'll bring something very different than the spiced JP Weisers. I'll bring something to make up for it.
I appreciate Karai keeping us humble. So
Dave, something you didn't, I don't know if you got into that much, but I know that at least I'm curious about, someone mentioned earlier, when we think of Canadian whiskey, we think of rye, and that's probably because of the Alberta. Do you want to talk about a little bit, obviously you talked about some of the mash bills, but how, I guess, it's differentiated from the Alberta, or when folks think of Canadian rye, how you kind of change their minds, or I guess re-educate them about, no, this is not the Alberta rye you're used to.
Yeah, I mean, even so, it's, one thing that Gina and I, one big part of our job, as you can imagine, because Gina only works in the US and we work with the US, like we get compared, Lot 40 gets compared to American rye all the time, or we get asked, like, what are the big differences between American rye whiskey, Canadian rye whiskey? There's over 36 categories of just American whiskey out there. Somebody's got some leftover bottles there. As far as Canadian goes, like Alberta versus Ontario, it's a great question. I mean, I don't hear that very often. You have of course, the Albertans, the Ontario want to drink their own, they're local. But I mean, essentially, like, we kind of always go on the Canada versus America, where we talk about mash bills, where Canada traditionally produces 100% mash bills, where, I don't have to tell you guys, better than I do, we're American, it's going to be 51% rye. And then usually there's some barley or other grains, and the grains are blended during the mash. Fermentation, we talked earlier that we usually use exogenous enzymes. And I think in America, it's like some exogenous, some endogenous, I think. Gina could answer that better than I could. She worked in American whiskey forever. And then distillation, we've got many different distillation styles here, from once column, double pot, column and pot. And, in America, I believe you can't exceed 160 proof. Is that right? And it's always column and doubler for American rye.
Yep. I don't think rye is as strict as bourbon, the regulations around it, but it's close to that. No, I was more wondering about, it's probably because Alberta tends to outsource, or rather not outsource, but they tend to, everyone sources from Alberta, including Whistlepig. So
I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. So yes, when I was saying that, like, we make, out of the 5 million cases, and 1 million of them are ours, this is, if you guys haven't realized already, I'm very honest about everything I speak to. But as you can imagine, I can't speak to what whiskeys we make unless they say it out loud. I'm not allowed to talk about what whiskeys come out of our distillery, like Canadian Club does, but I can't speak to the American ones that come out of our distillery.
So theoretically, there's a potential that some may be sourced from you, is what you're saying, but you can't say that.
Yeah, and it was one of the Gina, who hopefully you'll get to work with one day too. Was like, she was the first one she blew my mind on a few things, because she's not her whole life, but she's just one of the most well-educated people I know, especially in the American whiskey categories. And when she first brought it to me, she was like, oh yeah, she's like, not a straight rye, but she's like, we can just buy rye from anywhere and bring it and bottle it and just write on the label like American rye. And I was so blown away by that, because it was so different from Canadian whiskey, where we can't do that. Now, obviously, that's not a fact for a straight rye whiskey, American straight rye whiskey. But yeah, there's stuff that comes out of our distillery that's not Canadian whiskey, I guess, but it's fermented, distilled, and aged in Canada, bottled somewhere else. I wish I could say more.
No. Thank you for that. I understand that you can't go further, but no, appreciate that.
I will say this: I've had funny instances where I've had a bartender tell me, like, "Oh yeah, Lot 40 is okay, but I much more prefer this. This is my go-to," and I just sit there and just like, amazing, there's not much I can say, but I'm like, if you only knew, if you only knew. The spice with water is good. The spiced with Coca-Cola too. Someone's told me they like it with Coke for a little spiked vanilla Coke.
Oh my gosh.
Interesting. Well, Dave, I have to say I've learned a lot this evening, more than I thought I was going to. So thank you for the really good deep dive into Canadian whiskeys. This was great.
Well, I was going to say, I feel like it was a more of, I always call myself the actor and, you know, the entertainer and the storyteller. Like, next time you guys are ready to go in again and we can get some other expressions, we'll get Karai and we'll get Dr. Don to come on.
That'd be wonderful.
We'll get Dr. Don to, like, if you guys want to geek out.
Yep, we do.
Geek out.
We do. We love and appreciate the deeper dives into the background and the origins and all the things that affect, you know, the expressions. We really do like that a lot.
He'll get into the strains and he's pure science. Pure science.
No, that would be fantastic. And thank you, Karai and Vidium, again for putting this all together.
Thank you so much, David. Yeah, thank you, Dave. Thank you, Karai. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Not kicking anyone out, but we're gonna hit stop. We're gonna end the tasting, and we just hang out off the record. So, cheers, everyone, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks for having me, guys. I guess last thing is, if you have any questions at all, no matter how small, reach out to Karai, and he's got my email, and I'll get back to you right away.
Oh, that was almost like a perfect. If you have any questions, reach out to Karai. He'll take care of it. Bye.
No, or my email is dave.mitton@pernod-ricard.com, but I mean he can forward it to you and just shoot me an email. Anything.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it.
Really appreciate it, Dave.
Take care.